Greetings, devil hunters. It's getting dark out here. I hope you don't mind this certain someone walking beside us. They'll be joining us tonight as we continue our study of the dark and the sinister. It seems they're taking us to a garden through a rainy field of tombstones. How pleasant. Welcome back, everyone.
Welcome back.
It's been several months now since our first analysis of William Blake's poetry in the context of Devil May Cry 5. We established some fascinating parallels between Blake's prose and the plight of Vergil through our analysis of 5 essential poems, and it is these 5 happenings that masterfully illustrate the brutal alterations of Vergil's inner psyche. However, even some of these poems were not scrutinized as deeply as I would have liked. In fact, not even close. Tonight, we will revisit and venture far beyond these essential 5, adding cohesion to Vergil's story with more relevant works by William Blake. As you'll see tonight, the biblical allusions and Blake-inspired motifs contribute immensely to this game's storytelling, elevating the hidden messages of this game to an unforeseen level of depth. By the end of tonight, you will never view Devil May Cry 5 in quite the same light as you do now. I can only hope that our guest doesn't get too excited. Let us begin. Brace yourself, as this one's going to get sinister. It begins. These 2 Blake collections, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, hold a wealth of rich parallels to the Devil May Cry universe. They represent 2 opposing sides of the human consciousness. Songs of Innocence depicts the blissful innocence of childhood, a time associated with the Unfallen World. The Unfallen World is shielded from inhibition and sin. On the other hand lies the Songs of Experience, which conversely explores the loss of childhood innocence, the vices of human emotion, and the corruptive forces that constrain individual liberty, namely the established church. The Songs of Experience, then, is the descent into the fallen world. The terms Unfallen World and Fallen World represent a popular romantic dichotomy, referring to man's state of being before and after the original sin, which is also known as the fall of man. This transition from the unfallen world to the fallen world is what we are fated to. Many romantic thinkers were heavily captivated by these 2 states of consciousness, namely William Wordsworth, John Milton, and William Blake. Keep this duality of the innocent unfallen world versus the corrupt and fallen world in mind, as it is critical to understanding Blake's influence on Devil May Cry 5. Throughout these 2 collections, the poem's contrasting titles represent this descent from childhood purity into the excruciating realities of the human condition. For example, we have the blossom in the Songs of Innocence versus the sick rose in the Songs of Experience, and the lamb versus the tiger. But most importantly, we have infant joy versus infant sorrow, which, perhaps more so than any other pair, epitomizes this duality of the unfallen world versus the fallen world. We'll analyze these 2 in just a moment, but first, let's contextualize how this duality is cleverly incorporated into Devil May Cry 5. In the lens of Vergil's story, this duality is ultimately framed by one key incident, the tragic day of Ava's murder.
Vergil! Where are you, Vergil?
That horrid moment when demons speared through his young flesh and slaughtered his mother was Vergil's fall from grace. That brutish impalement was his descent from the unfallen world into the fallen world. Therefore, the state of childhood innocence, which again denotes the unfallen world, is embodied by Vergil's childhood joy before that fateful day of the demon's assault. After he descended into the fallen world, Vergil was forced to combat his vicious tormentors. And here is the quintessential work that portrays this descent into the fallen world: infant sorrow. This is Vergil's fall from grace as the naked, helpless child thrust into an unforgiving world. As he talks to Trish, V can actually be seen reading Infant Sorrow from his book of Blake poems. It reads, "My mother groaned, my father wept. Into the dangerous world I leapt, helpless, naked, piping loud, like a fiend hid in a cloud, struggling in my father's hands, striving against my swaddling bands. Bound and weary, I thought best to sulk upon my mother's breast. These two stanzas illustrate the brutal assault that befell Vergil and slaughtered his mother. This iconography of a naked, helpless Vergil is similar to that of his flashback in the DMC3 light manga, and he is indeed a piping loud Vergil, crying for help as seen in Visions of V. The swaddling bands represent his restricted strength as a mere child. He is impaled by a vicious circle of blades, bound and weary indeed, as scarlet streams trickle out from his young body. It was this inability to protect his mother that instilled in him an obsessive thirst for power, a juvenile, infantile pursuit. He clung on to this pursuit like an infant sulking upon the breast of its mother, developing an unquenchable lust for godhood. These two stanzas portray the shattering of Vergil's childhood purity, his own fall from grace, a savage awakening that would rip Vergil from the unfallen world and pin him, quite literally, to the fallen world. This pernicious moment echoes the themes of the Songs of Experience. The line, "Into the dangerous world I leapt," expresses his descent as his first encounter with demon kind. But what exactly does this impalement represent? Is there something more at play here? Interesting. We'll dive deeper into this later on. The poem Infant Sorrow has a counterpart in the Songs of Innocence by the name of Infant Joy. When asked his name by Dante, V recites Infant Joy, a poem that epitomizes the aforementioned themes of the Songs of Innocence. V first says, "I have no name, I am but 2 days old," when conveniently enough, he is indeed a 2-day-old infant, being born on May 1st and meeting with Dante on May 3rd. This mimics the poem very closely. The infant names himself Joy. After claiming, "Joy is my name," the mother then binds the name Joy to the infant, effectively prescribing him a life of happiness and joy ahead. Similarly, V, a 2-day-old infant, names himself V after the book he carries in Visions of V. This book is a memento of his younger self quarreling with Dante, as the two would often fight over their belongings. As a result, Vergil learned to mark his possessions with a V. This is the sole possession that survived his fall from grace. Thankfully for V, it is the embodiment of childhood comfort, as he would regularly retreat into literature after his childhood contentions. And by naming himself after his cherished memento, he is taking a second chance to live as a loving, compassionate human. Infant Joy represents a second coming of Vergil's infancy, a life liberated from the possessive influences of his demonic half, and therefore a second imagining of Vergil's youthful innocence before he was inundated with anguish on that dreadful day. This is a recurring theme in Visions of V. V constantly reminisces on the sweet joy and mirth of his childhood, perhaps longing for a return to the unfallen world. There's another crucial poem that mimics his yearning for his early years, but we'll save this for later. Interestingly, there is yet another character that represents childhood innocence and the unfallen world, Dante.
Looks like your master's got you on a pretty short leash. Come on, little puppy. I'll take you out for a walk. Come on, let's go.
Because Ava hid him, Dante was protected from those pernicious forces, in this case, the bloodthirsty demons, that violently awakened his brother. Ava even says, "Be a big boy. A man, huh? You must change your name. Forget your past and start a new life as someone else." And thus, Tony renamed himself Dante. This, essentially, is another instance of Infant Joy shielding Dante from the horrors that threatened his childhood innocence. Yes, he did still suffer and grieve over his family, but he did not fall like Vergil did. As he grew older, Dante preserved the love and compassion that his family instilled in him, whereas Vergil discarded it in favor of demonic strength. And how appropriate that these two spiritual embodiments of Songs of Innocence, V and Dante, have aligned themselves towards a common objective, speaking in the words of Infant Joy. Despite their moments of anguish, both of them have preserved aspects of their childhood innocence. This ties into the larger metaphor that Dante and V, having embraced their humanity, are able to access that joy and mirth that their mother wanted for them. But Vergil, incessantly fighting to unleash his fully demonic self and eventually succeeding, was no longer capable of love or joy. He had fallen like no other, and tonight we will further examine the seeds of sin planted within him before, during, and after this fatal incident. We've established how both infant joy and infant sorrow frame the duality of innocence and experience, respectively. Now, let's build further on this foundation. Our guest seems intent on showing us this garden. Beyond these two poems, there are a number of additional poems in the Songs of Experience that add tremendously to this duality and the story at large. That garden draws near. Let us proceed. Here in this garden we now stand, a fated return to the beginning land. Before we explore the Garden of Love, I'd like to paint a picture of Vergil's childhood comfort. Blake's unique interpretation of Christianity holds many parallels to biblical imagery and characters, as entities beyond our kind would visit him commonly. It is said that God peered into his window when he was but 4 years old. Angels would float before his eager eyes. For Blake, originality was his everything, his guiding principle. I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create. And so he, like other romantics, would father his own imagining of God, his own Genesis, his own Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and his own Satan, as we'll explore in great detail some other time. But here we now stand, at Blake's own imagining of the Garden of Eden, called the Garden of Love. This poem, despite its tantalizing glimpses of mirth and joy, is rightfully part of the Songs of Experience. The Garden of Love portrays two contrasting states of the Garden of Eden, the first before the fall of man, and the second, current state of being after the fall of man.
What are you getting at?
You know all too well what I'm getting at this point. This, right here, is Vergil's Garden of Eden, his Garden of Love, where his aforementioned fall from grace occurred. And like Urizen says, it's all an illusion created by this extraordinary fruit. This illusory dimension manifests as the fallen state of Vergil's childhood garden. Perhaps the Qliphoth fruit is drawing from V's memories to conjure up this garden. I want you to focus on the imagery here as V awakens Dante with the Sparta sword. While walking through this fragmented reality, Dante and V witness a place that resembles the garden that once lay in front of their home as children. Approaching the coarse, high grasses and his beloved rocking horse, V reminisces on his cheerful youth. This was his unfallen world, his childhood sanctuary. He says,
I was here. I can still see it. In fact, I was playing right here.
Much like the fourth line of the Garden of Love reads, where I used to play on the green. Green. Yes, those luscious, viridescent fields of grass where V used to run and play. But this is barely a morsel of what's to come. Let's walk through the entire poem. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I had never seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play in the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be. And priests in black gowns were walking their rounds, and binding with briars my joys and desires. The first two lines signify V's return to his childhood garden, now a fallen garden. The chapel is a recurring theme in many Blake poems, signifying the oppressive reign of established religion. Here, he describes it as a specific, concrete iteration of the church, one that encroached upon his pride and joy, being built atop his beloved garden. But in a more holistic lens, the chapel represents a cosmic, tyrannical presence that constrains the raw emotions, urges, and liberties of the people, a presence that preys off of the people, leeching away their money, inhibiting their behaviors, and threatening their individual sense of intimacy with God. While the chapel visually resembles Vergil's home, Blake's chapel is conceptually paralleled by the hell gates that demons use to enter the human world, which may be Malay Island of DMC-1 or Temminigru of DMC-3. The chapel is essentially the birthplace of sin and corruption, spawning devils and demons. In the context of DMC-5, it is the Clyfoth tree. Just as Blake saw the church as a parasite that sucked the innocent, childlike vitality from the people, the Clyfoth would ravenously suck the carmine blood right out of them, rendering them hollow, lifeless husks. And when fully nourished, it would bear its sinful fruit, again alluding to the fall of man and the original sin. But we'll save this for later. Back to the chapel for now. Turning away from this awful church, Blake turned to the sweet flowers that once lay in the garden. Those flowers were no more, for graves and tombstones lay in their places. This iconography is extremely similar to that of Vergil's childhood garden. Graves and tombstones are strewn about this fallen garden that lay in fragments before the chapel. Perhaps this is what a fallen world and a fallen garden of love must look like. A place adorned with death, decay, and the horrible plagues born of the chapel. And from that chapel came priests in black gowns. Black gowns are often worn by members of the clergy who hold power and authority in sacred places. The priests in black gowns, walking their rounds, and binding with briars Blake's joys and desires. The intrusion of the priests in Blake's garden is paralleled by the invasion of demons in Vergil's garden. Were these not the priests in black gowns, that came on that fateful day, impaling Vergil with their spears and binding him to the fallen world? And had they not come from a chapel, a cosmic leech that threatened Vergil's innocence and fueled his fear? Yes, they had, and from hell to earth they brought their spears, and with those spears they sealed away his innocence and bliss, binding with briars his joys and desires. This line alludes to Christ's crucifixion. The word briars alludes to the spiky crown that tormented Christ, acting as a torture device during his crucifixion. This, in essence, was Vergil's crucifixion in his now fallen garden. There he was, binded with spears of the dark priests that came from hell. And that is the Garden of Love. This massively elevates the allegorical storytelling at play here. But now, let's approach this tragic fall from a different angle. Let's dive deeper now into the aforementioned contentions between Dante and Vergil and how Ava influenced this dynamic. Allow me to share with you the angel. The angel was actually quoted by V, just the third stanza, in Visions of V, after V recalls how he survived his fall from grace, slaying his tormentors with his newfound strength. So we can almost grasp how this was meant to be incorporated. But The Angel is one of Blake's most equivocal poems and is still being interpreted to this day in a myriad of contexts, such as war, sexual awakening, and many others. But despite its many interpretations, its core motifs are almost undeniable, some of which are the loss of innocence, which echoes the songs of experience as a whole, and repressed urges. But perhaps the loudest of themes, in my interpretation, is the theme of unrequited or unreciprocated love. And this is the theme I want you to focus on when we examine The Angel. I dreamt a dream, what can it mean? And that I was a maiden queen, guarded by an angel mild. witless woe was near beguiled, and I wept both night and day, and he wiped my tears away, and I wept both day and night, and hid him from my heart's delight. So he took his wings and fled, then the morn blushed rosy red. I dried my tears and armed my fears with 10,000 shields and spears. Soon my angel came again. I was armed, he came in vain, for the time of youth was fled, and gray hairs were on my head. The maiden queen in this context is Ava, Vergil's mother. She is guarded by an angel mild, with mild indicating that the angel is not his awakened or fully realized self. Though the angel character plays a rather ambiguous role in many of Blake's poems, he often represents a guardian, a male suitor, or in this case, a sweet, innocent child. The angel here is Vergil, Ava the maiden queen, guarded by her angel mild, a young Vergil. The line, witless woe was near beguiled, is fascinating. Witless woe implies that Ava suffered through unwarranted sorrows, unnecessary pains. Perhaps these witless woes arose from her hatred of her children's incessant fighting, their petulant quarrels that she so despised. Vergil felt that her love for Dante was far greater than her love for himself, and would constantly fight to win her love back, which would then result in her tears. And he wiped her tears away, but it mattered not, as Vergil always felt responsible as the older brother. He would struggle with Ava's wishes for him to look out for his younger brother, and he felt that Ava hid her heart from him. That motherly love that Dante stole was hidden from Vergil, hence the line, and hid him from my heart's delight. So he took his wings and fled signifies a spiritual awakening, a young angel yearning to take flight with his wings. And is that not what transpired that day, after being impaled by spears and watching his vermilion vitality flow out of his own body, and harnessing that once dormant power within him to decimate his tormentors? Then the morn blushed rosy red describes the scarlet fields coated with blood, blood of the demons just as much as his own. And here in the last two stanzas is where the angel offers a change in regard to perspective. Since V quotes it as a mantra of his own awakening on the day of his crucifixion, the I in this poem from this point forth is from the perspective of that young Vergil. I dried my tears and armed my fears with 10,000 shields and spears. These two lines embody his dire need for strength, his resolve to defend himself after he was ruthlessly impaled and after his mother was killed. No more time for tears, he must have thought. After his fall from grace, he would muster up the strength and the defense, the swords and shields, to annihilate any demon that he encountered thereafter. Soon my angel came again. I was armed, he came in vain, may represent how Vergil would guard himself against his own feelings of childhood innocence and weakness thereafter. His angel was that innocent, unrealized version of his younger self, the epitome of his fear and weakness. This vulnerable aspect of his psyche that initially weakened and scared him now came in vain, as he had harnessed his demonic strength. He would slaughter any evil in his way when he sensed weakness, that inner angel in himself. And building onto that are the last two lines, for the time of youth was fled, and gray hairs were on my head. This, again, indicates the shedding of his pure, innocent younger self, and leaving a forsaken, awakened demon swordsman to fend for himself in the fallen world. Fascinating. Considering that Visions of V quotes the third stanza through the perspective of Vergil, I do think my above interpretation stands as the most cohesive, even if the entirety of the poem was not meant to tie into Vergil and Ava. But, just to humor it, the last two stanzas do hold another meaning if the poem is continued from Ava's perspective as the maiden queen. If I is Ava, her arming herself with shields and spears may represent the barrier to love that had built up between Vergil and herself, or at least a metaphorical barrier that Vergil had felt. She would tell him, "Don't provoke fights, you're older after all." And time again, Dante and Vergil would continue to bloody each other up. So the next time Vergil came at her for love, she was armed with that barrier of mixed emotions, unable to truly show him her love. And so he came in vain, and that is the unrequited love once again, as expressed by the earlier line, and hid him from my heart's delight. The last two lines, for Ava, signified that her time to love Vergil was gone, and that the gray hairs would then indicate her death at the hands of demons. The last encounter they had, on that day Vergil stormed off, was one of unrequited love and unresolved feelings. And this is the motif that speaks the loudest here in both interpretations of the last two stanzas. I'd like to mention here that the envious, resentful nature of these poems corresponds to the inner pains of Vergil's mind, more so than objectively portraying the relationship among the three. Being jealous of the attention that his younger sibling received, the angel must have been particularly meaningful to him. That being said, the poem, My Pretty Rose Tree, is characterized by envy, which applies to Vergil's jealousy of Dante, and the attention that Dante steals from Ava. It's much less complex than the angel, but it still holds immense value for our analysis, as it illustrates, once again, unrequited love as a sorrow that Vergil casts on Ava, opposite to that of the angel. It reads, "A flower was offered to me, such a flower as May never bore. But I said, I've a pretty rose tree, and I passed the sweet flower o'er. Then I went to my pretty rose tree, to tend to her by day and by night. But my rose turned away with jealousy, and her thorns were my only delight." The narrator here is Ava, and the pretty rose tree is Vergil. Ava is offered a beautiful flower, a flower so especially rare and magnificent, but she passes on this flower as she already has Vergil, her pretty rose tree. That beautiful flower is Dante, her second son. When Ava tends to Vergil, her first love, Vergil bitterly turns away with jealousy. Vergil's thorns of resentment and hatred for Dante would always scream louder than Ava's love for him. Even if Ava promised to love Vergil to the end, Vergil simply couldn't fathom it, as Dante stole the attention that he so craved. And so, he turned away from his mother, festering with envy, and thus embodying the theme of unrequited love himself. But that love was not entirely unrequited, as Vergil's jealousy is indicative of his intent to reciprocate his mother's love. And so, his love both attracted and repelled Ava, characteristic of the thorny, vile plague that ailed him, the rose tree, and that virulent, unresolved envy would turn him into a sick rose. This poem is famous for its vivid sexual metaphors. It speaks to the corruptive influences of lust and sexual desire on the uncontaminated mind of unfallen youth, and of course, that youth here is Vergil. While lustful desire is obviously not the source of Vergil's anguish, a similar sort of sinister seduction is at play here. And with the aforementioned envy and disharmony stirring in his heart, this child was particularly susceptible to such influences.
People inherently fear evil. However, occasionally a person may become seduced by evil.
O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. The rose is akin to the female sexual desire, while the invisible worm is a male phallic agent that flies through the night to express its sinful lust to the rose. And Vergil, already stewing with anguish and grief, is that sick rose, tempted by his lust for strength after his crucifixion and his mother's death. And in his pit of despondency, raw power was the only temptation that truly appealed to him. Perhaps his impalement on that day was when that metaphorical worm found its way into him and tempted him with his own demonic potential, sowing seeds of lust deep within him. Perhaps this was their bed of crimson joy in the bloody fields that had fallen so deep and taken young Vergil to fall within them. And those seeds of sin would turn that once pretty rose tree into a poison tree. Before diving into the story's inevitable climax in Blake's poem, A Poison Tree, I want to briefly touch on the moment Vergil divides himself into V and Urizen. During this moment, he utters the words, "Heavy chain that does freeze my bones around." The full line reads, "Break this heavy chain that does freeze my bones around," from the poem Earth's Answer, which corresponds to the poem Introduction, both from the Songs of Experience. In the first analysis, we established that these two poems resemble a dialogue between Mother Earth, personified as a woman, and a religious bard character. This religious figurehead has stripped Mother Earth of her feelings of joy, delight, and sexual desire. This stands as a metaphor for the sexual and emotional restraints that male figureheads set on women, the chains of chastity. Her spiritual impoverishment is made clear through the lines, "Earth raised up her heads, from the darkness, dread and drear. Her light fled, stony dread, and her locks covered with grey despair." This is another instance of Blake's criticisms of the established church. The church is one of the primary institutions that Blake associated with the impure fallen world, causing the fall of innocent humans. Earth's Answer furthers the idea that religion sucks the childlike spirit from the people, inhibiting them and constraining their raw urges and desires. And in addition to sucking this life from the people, religion opened the doors to new levels of human degeneracy, with figureheads being able to control people with an unforeseen degree of power. Similarly, if we revisit the chapel and dark priest analogy that we built earlier during our analysis of the Garden of Love, Blake's cosmic presence of religion is paralleled by the demon world, or hell, of Devil May Cry. The demons of hell are locked in a struggle for power, constantly fighting for might and control. This is exemplified by Goliath and many others. And after Vergil was binded by the dark priests of hell, he had fallen too to the temptations of godhood and almighty control, very much akin to Blake's view of religion. So when Vergil cries, "Break this heavy chain that does freeze my bones around," he is grieving over the death of his childhood vitality and dreading the fallen world that has tempted him. The chains that freeze his bones around represent his ravenous lust for might and omnipotence that has plagued his psyche since his fall. He is enslaved by this lust, chained by it. He is pleading for any semblance of return to his previous innocence, to cleanse himself of these possessive influences. When he cried these words, he was not hoping to malform into Urizen. He was hoping to return to his childhood innocence that had been long ripped away by his fault from grace, materialized by V. I'm aware that my initial analysis saw this line as Vergil breaking free of the restrictions on his urges of wrath and anger, and it's totally feasible that his convoluted emotions produced a frenzy of both urges, the urge to return to his childhood innocence and his urge to fully commit to a power-hungry corruption of himself. But his urge to extricate himself from this suffocating thirst for power seems to add cohesion to the grander themes at hand. This is supported by the liberating messages in the final stanza of Earth's Answer, which includes, "Break this heavy chain that does freeze my bones around, that free love with bondage bound." Earth's intent is to free love, to rejuvenate her lifeblood. Similarly, Vergil's desire to revitalize his capacity for compassion and love after ridding himself of that for so long was inevitable. His wishes resulted in a being that could finally step back to recognize his tunneled vision and recover from his poisonous aims.
In separating and regaining my human soul, I've realized the gravity of the crime I've committed. I've realized how important everything was. Everything I've thrown away in my pursuit of power.
V. and only through that untainted mind could he see the folly of his ways. Only now could he recognize his true foe. And this clash of self and foe is the famous confrontation of DMC5, as described in Blake's poem, A Poison Tree. Here it is, the big bad, the quintessential poem that defines the climax of Vergil's story, and beyond that, the very essence, the heart of Devil May Cry 5. We analyze the core importance of this poem at the end of the first poetry analysis, but this time, we have a comprehensive journey of poems that ultimately frame this poem as the climax, the violent eruption of V's other half. By now, we've analyzed V and Dante as manifestations of childhood innocence, an innocence that Vergil lost so early on. V, finally free of Vergil's influences, could now value the love and compassion his family once instilled in him, reminiscing on those early experiences as a second chance at joy, as seen in Infant Joy. We've explored many pernicious happenings that sparked Vergil's fall from grace, including the rising dissonance that threatened the love between him and his mother, as seen in The Angel, My Pretty Rose Tree, and A Sick Rose. We've studied his experience in the Unfallen World, his childhood days of joy and mirth, as well as his descent into the fallen world through his ghastly crucifixion and the loss of his mother's love, as seen in Infant Sorrow, The Garden of Love, and The Angel. And these struggles produced the fallen Vergil, stirring with grief, sorrow, and unresolved urges after his mother's death and his bloody impalement. Note the transformation of Vergil in the context of Blake's floral imagery, from a pretty rose tree to a fallen, sick rose that has lost its exuberance. He was then embedded with the lust for godhood on the crimson bed of his crucifixion, as analyzed earlier. And from this point, he would engage in many battles for power. He would then rid himself of this awful temptation and Earth's answer, resulting in V and Urizen. And now, here we stand in that fallen garden. Our guest is trembling with tears of excitement. Here is A Poison Tree. I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it not, my wrath did grow, and I watered it in fears, night and morning with my tears, and I sunned it with smiles, and with soft deceitful wiles, and it grew both day and night, till it bore an apple bright, and my foe beheld it shine, and he knew that it was mine, and into my garden stole, when the night had veiled the pole. In the morning, glad I see my foe outstretched beneath the tree. There it is. With everything we've learned, you alone are fully capable of deciphering this, I'm sure. Keep in mind that this is from Vergil's perspective as his young self and his V, and the foe he describes is Urizen. Let us proceed. The first stanza denotes two distinct ways of dealing with anger. The phrase, I was angry with my foe, I told it not, my wrath did grow, is precisely what Vergil was burdened with so early on. His foe is his vile temptation, his lust for might and control. These forbidden seeds of lust were sown on that awful day in his garden of love, on the bed of crimson joy, morphing him into a sick rose. And those sorry seeds would grow, nourished by Vergil's fears of weakness and of danger, his tears that followed his lost innocence and dead mother. Sunned by his fickle smiles in the face of his newfound power and his furtive scheming, the emotional tumult that emerged from his fall, from his envy of Dante, from all his wounds from all angles. It's all here in this second stanza. Trauma has many masks, and Vergil wears all of those, and more. And those seeds of poison bore fruit, of blood-soaked trophy for those fallen deep enough to crave it. And Urizen, the foe, beheld that fruit, and he knew that it was Vergil's, as Vergil sliced open a hole with the Omato so that the Qliphoth could enter the human world. The church, the Clyfoth, had now encroached upon Vergil's beloved garden, and out of that church came its priests to feast on the people. They gathered blood and human vitality for the church, the Clyfoth, to feed on, to ripen its fruit. And Urizen, the foe, devoured it voraciously, completing the allegory of original sin. The fallen one had fallen further, to the lowest depths of despair and corruption, and of course, he lay dying, outstretched beneath the tree, his lifeblood completely diminished by that virulent fruit.
That last shred of humanity that you still had? You just lost it.
In truth, Urizen's loss was guaranteed before he even began fighting Dante. This is the battle between tender human innocence and the agents of the fallen world that threatens such innocence. The fallen world that we all are destined to face, and I can only pray that we preserve our vitality when we witness that evil. And that is a poison tree. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our special guest would like to embrace you for making it this far. And by making it to this point, you've proved two things. One, that you have a special interest in the deeper meanings of Vergil's story. And two, that you have an attention span longer than that of a goldfish. Congratulations. Those two things are very much appreciated. All jokes aside, never have I felt quite this emotionally embraced by the storytelling of a game, especially when its story is so beautifully amplified by its deeper meanings. I absolutely adore the wealth of allegorical writing in Devil May Cry 5, and am so glad to have shared my interpretations with even a handful of people. If your experience of Devil May Cry 5 was even marginally elevated by the poetic lens that I've offered, my mission would be complete. And one last nugget of interest, before I let my mind rest. When Vergil's two halves reunite, he is wearing a black cloak like the black gown of the clergy, as if he's become a fallen, dark priest himself. But his cloak also has blue engravings and a blue inner garment, perhaps to indicate that he's reclaimed his childlike vitality to some capacity, just some food for thought. Anyway, never will I trivialize this game to a wacky wahoo pizza man adventure, not because I think it doesn't jest around and have fun, as it certainly does, but because its Blake-inspired symbolism and biblical allegories are simply deafening. They ring too loud and shine too bright for me to look past them. This game exemplifies the undying influence that Blake and other romantics hold on modern art. Feel free to share your thoughts on my interpretations in the comments below, and show this to anyone that loves Devil May Cry lore and William Blake prose. Perhaps next time, we could learn more about this character in Blake's mythos by diving into the Book of Urizen. My editor and I worked countless hours to produce this. I hope you enjoyed the phenomenal work they've done here. Special thanks to Dakota for the wonderful art pieces. Special thanks as well to my supporters on Patreon, Mark 5, Andre Novoa, the one and only W, Tina, Katie Boone, Jareel Moon, Adriel, John Griever, Micah Let's Play, John Wick, Albert Kessa, and Kokujin. Thank you for going above and beyond to support my content. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and check the YouTube community tab for updates. I wish you, and our special guest, a good night, full of rain and frights. I'll see you again, I'm sure. Perhaps, just as I descend into the fallen world.